Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight for the Pennsylvania Big Woods Whitetail presentation with Bo Martonic of East Meets West Hunt. This is part of the 12-part Filson Skills Night series. We've been running this through early October, and it features some great speakers and information to help improve your experience and success in the field. Before we get started, I'm your host. My name is Keith Colonna. I am the Western Region Chairman for the Pennsylvania chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And I'll also be your moderator for the evening. So I'll be taking care of doing the question and answer session afterwards with Bo. So if you have any questions, make sure you either write them down during his presentation, and then you can put them in to the Crowdcast, and then I'll review them afterwards. So before we get to the program, I would like to take a moment to thank Filson for sponsoring this series. Filson is also helping us celebrate September, which is Public Lands Month, by launching some pretty cool limited edition product. It's co-branded with BHA. You can find it at filson.com. Actually wearing one of their hats right now. I can kind of see it there. And then these are the other ones that they have online. So it's pretty cool stuff. So if you want to get your hands on some of this stuff, I would encourage you to check out their website. Show your support for BHA and public lands, waters, and wildlife. In addition to all of that, Filson has donated a large dry duffel bag and a wool hat valued at around $275 that we'll be giving away as a door prize at every event in this series, including tonight. So stick around and make sure you tune in to other events moving forward as well for that. So minor housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, we'll be giving away the door prize at the end of the event tonight, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Also, like I said before, write down your questions that arise during the presentation so that you have them handy for the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can before we announce our door prize winner and wrap up for the evening. So without further ado, we will go ahead and move on to the show.
When it comes to scouting big woods mountain bucks, I'm using onX Hunt app to be able to scout online and in the field. But the first step that I do before heading into a new area is be able to pull up the onX Hunt web map. So from my computer screen, I'm able to go through and start scouting some of these areas. Some important layers that onX has that I use for scouting the big woods happens to be the government lands feature. So the public lands, being able to tell where the state game lands, state forest, and national forests are within anywhere in the Appalachian region, specifically in the Pennsylvania and New York region here for myself. In addition to the public lands, you're able to view all the private land boundaries, one, to make sure that you're not trespassing, but also to be able to see where there's potential access, or if you wanted to ask permission to be able to hunt some of these different properties. With the private lands feature, you're able to pull up the landowner's name, their tax address, and how many acres that they own, so you're able to get in contact with the landowner. Even if, say, you're hunting a neighboring public piece and you shoot a deer and it runs onto that property, at least you'll know who to get a hold of and who to talk to in that case to be able to access that property. Another feature that's really good to use when it comes to figuring out private properties and public property is something called the possible access. And in Pennsylvania, we have a tab here in the layers under the Pennsylvania tab that says PA possible access. When you turn that on, you're able to see, shows that we have over 520,000 acres of land that could potentially be open to public hunting, and usually that's including timber and land conservation groups that have these properties. So they'll show up in these green dots, and you just click on the name. It'll pop up, say this one is owned, for example, by Collins Pines property. But what you could do is just Google search Collins Pines Company, check them out, look in and see if they have anything on their website posted about public hunting. If not, being able just to reach out and contact them to see if you're able to hunt that. It can be a really good feature for finding some hidden honey holes that are away from everyone else that's scouting the public pieces. Another important layer that I use in just about every state that I'm in when I'm hunting public land is the trails and rec layers, and I'll turn just about all of them on. The trails, the trail slope, trail mileage, motor vehicle trails and roads, and what these all mean basically is you're able to see where there's hiking trails at, where there's potential access for yourself and also other hunters, And by having the trail slope feature on, you can see the differences in the colors from yellow to red for more difficult trails, and the green ones are a little bit milder, less sloped. And in between portions, they'll have trail mileage. So when you have that feature turned on, you can see here this one's 0.9 miles in between access points or forks in the trail. And once again, this is a feature that I like to use for access if I want to get further back into a spot, but also realizing that other people can do the same thing and it's an easier walk for them. So pay attention to that when you're picking some of your spots. The motor vehicle feature allows you to find out where there's the ATV trails or possible 4x4 access, and even areas that are only open certain times of the year. And these are identified by these purple and kind of pink dotted lines. When you click on these trails, it gives you a trail ID, tells you what it is. Like for example, this one was open for ATVs, off-highway use, less than 50 inches wide, and is seasonal. The dates they have listed there, the time frame when it's open. In addition to that, they also have the ranger district, anything else to be able to get a hold of them to figure out, what's open, what's legal if you had any sort of questions. I tend to stay away from the areas that have off-highway vehicle use and also 4x4 vehicle use during the season, just because most of the time that's going to be the easiest access and people are going to utilize that to get back into areas that they normally wouldn't. When it comes to being able to add waypoints, whether I'm using that from the web map like I am right now or I'm doing it in the field, I like to stay organized with that, being able to use different icons and different color coding systems to be able to identify and be able to quickly go back when I'm scouting and getting ready to hunt, be able to pull all this information from my spring scouting or late season scouting and be able to utilize that in the fall in an organized manner. So when it comes to adding a waypoint, for example, we're on the edge of this logging cut here on the south slope of a hill. We'll put a mark here and say maybe potential for doe bedding. And if I was in the field and found doe beds, I would mark it as doe bedding. Come down here to the waypoint type. Let's look here. We have bedding area. Or for me personally, I like just to use the doe icon and be able to set that there. Then you just hit, you could add a photo to it if you were in the field so you can kind of have an idea what's going on. Or you come down, write notes, and save. And now let's pretend that we're actually in the field right now and I'm going to mark a spot. So we're going to mark it down here at the bottom. Say I want a tree stand here. I would mark stand, come to the waypoints, go down to tree stand, and I mark all of my tree stands in the royal blue color. So that way, when it comes to the hunting season, you're looking at where am I going to hunt at, what am I going to do here. You can pull up your map with your thousands of waypoints if you're like me and be able to identify all the blue areas that you marked for potential stand locations. And it makes it a lot simpler than trying to navigate through all these different waypoints. Within these, when I'm marking a spot for a stand, I'm really detailed in my notes. So I'll come down here to the notes section and type in, good for northwest wind. I'll add into the notes sections the details about the location. For example, this one would be, say, good for a northwest wind, bucks to scent check the downward portion of a logging cut during the rut and set up in a triple cherry tree facing the trail and the scrape. And then I'll add a photo of, say, that triple cherry tree in there. So one thing, if you're coming in the dark with your headlamp, it's a little bit easier to be able to identify, because when you're scouting so many different areas, it's easy when you're in the moment to be like, yeah, I'll remember that. And then once it comes to time, it's a lot more difficult. So I try to take really detailed notes, being able to identify it. So when I go back in there, or it's 6 months down the road and I'm planning to hunt this spot, I already have an idea of what I'm getting into and being able to stay organized with it. Same thing comes for when I'm adding trail cameras into the mix. So with trail cameras, I'll go over to the waypoint type, click on the trail camera icon, and be able to color code that in the light blue section. And within the notes of this, I'm going to write what type of camera I have. So for example, if I had an Exodus Trek 2 hung on the tree, I'd put it on there, what type of lock I had it on. Do I have it up in the tree high where I need a stick to access it? What's the battery life looking at? All of those details are really important. So again, if I'm at home and I'm getting ready to go check one of these cameras, I can look at it and be like, oh, I need to make sure I bring spare batteries. It was getting kind of low last time. Or also just by color coding it to make it light blue, same thing with the tree stands. You can look at a map and kind of see your plot and how you're running your trail cam strategy through a specific area. Kind of helps me find gaps on areas I'm covering well and other areas that I'm not. Another feature that's really helpful to be able to use, especially when you're hunting with your buddies or any family members, is being able to share that waypoint. So from the web map, you can go through, click on it. Say for example, I wanted one of my friends to go and check one of my trail cameras for me. I could click on this icon right on the waypoint, click share, and it'll come up for a link for me to copy and email or text to, you know, my buddy that would be going to hunt that spot. If you're on your actual hunt app on your phone, it's really simple. You click share, it'll come up. You can text it right to somebody. They can pick it up, access it, and then say you decided you wanted to pull those rights from that person from being able to find where your stand is. All you have to do is remove their access or delete the waypoint, and it automatically removes off of their phone as well. This feature can be really helpful if you're trying to, you have a buck down on the ground, you're way back in the woods and you might need some help, and you're able to send out your waypoint. You can name it however you want, buck down. There's a waypoint for icon for meat. You can send that out to your family members, your friends, whoever is going to be there to help you, and they can come in and start helping you while you're going through the field processing. Just something worth mentioning is because of the way that this app works, and it works through an online database, even if you lost your phone in the field or something happened, it got smashed, that data is always backed up to your account. So you could still go online, it would have it there. You could log in from a different phone and all those waypoints will pop back up. When it comes to trying to actually find an area, because the big woods can be completely overwhelming when you look at it from a map or if you're looking at it from a state level. But one of the first things that I do to start choosing an area, especially if I'm going to a new state or just a completely new area, I'm looking at the major population centers within that state and trying to stay at least, kind of my rule of thumb is at least an hour away. If you can go 2 hours away, that's even better yet. But that kind of puts you out of the normal weekend trip for the people that are living in these populated areas. They're wanting to hunt a little bit closer to home on a weekend, and you're able to kind of get in a little bit more remote places with that. And one of the things I look for is the terrain. Terrain can dictate how people get to places. So steeper terrain where you have to hike, you know, say up 600, 700, 800 feet elevation gains, sometimes more, to get to an area, to get to a ridge, you're going to eliminate 95% of the hunters just with that. Or adding something like a river or a creek that you'd have to cross in there, that's another barrier to entry. So I look for all those things, especially if I think there's any potential for there to be increased human and hunting activity. There's a difference when it comes to hunting public land whitetails in the big wood setting. I kind of categorize it into two different sections. There's the big woods bucks and then there's mountain bucks. What the difference is and how you're looking for scouting is specifically mountain bucks are, in my opinion, you have a lot steeper terrain, narrower valleys, a lot more benches and topography into it. You'd have those big long oak ridges, more natural terrain funnels. I think a big, big open timber, mountain laurel patches on the sides of the hills, things along those lines, old growth forests. That's more of a mountain buck country, and I'm going to hunt that a little bit differently. Well, actually a lot differently than I would a typical big woods deer, where you still have topography and terrain and some decent size into the mountains and hills, but you also get a lot more vegetation features like your logging cuts and your hemlock thickets, and just a lot more breakup in the land, and your strategies when it comes to hunting these animals are a little bit differently. So kind of when you're looking to pick an area when you're scouting, have in mind what you want. Do you want to hunt these big ridges way out in the steep country, or do you want to hunt some more thicker areas, hunting these logging cuts, creek bottoms, beaver ponds? It all comes down to what you want out of the hunt and when you come into choosing an area. Now I kind of want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into these different terrain features. The first one that I'm going to talk about is a ridge. And ridges or ridge lines are areas of higher ground with steeper slopes on either side that tend to narrow out towards the end. Mature bucks and deer in general love these ridges. The tops usually have a lot of food, as long with the side hills. The mature deer aren't usually going to walk right across that open top for a few reasons. One being the human pressure, and the other one just they have a thermal advantage by being able to travel along the side of the hill just over the edge of a bench or just above it. Here's an example of a ridge line that runs all the way down through the end of the point. And that brings me to my next topic, which is a point or a spur, as some people might call it. And that's basically where the sloping line of higher ground comes down to a point or a V shape down towards the end. One of the main reasons why bucks are bedding there are because when they're out on these points, they can see about 270 degrees. They can have the prevailing wind blowing over their back as they're looking down over the hill and catching those thermals during the day. So those thermals that are coming up from the sun heating up the mountainside, from the weather warming up, it's coming up and blowing at them in the face. So in reality, they have just about all their areas covered, even when they're resting in their bed for the day. A saddle is a low point on a ridge line where you have two draws that run up and have a little bit of a dip in elevation there. These areas can be really important to key in on from the standpoint of it's a low-lying area in the hills. That's where the deer like to travel. If they're traveling from one valley or one ridge line to the other, if they're going to come up through, that's going to be one of the areas they're going to cross. In addition to that, still with how bucks run on ridges and deer run on ridges, running that side hill just below some sort of a major terrain feature or flat spot is creating a good crossing. And as we were talking about with most of the scouting, focusing in on that late October through November time frame, this can be a really good area to increase your odds of being able to see a buck cruising. And I just mentioned within talking about saddles about the draw, which is the low-lying area or depression that slopes downward from the top of the mountains. Sometimes can be in a saddle, other times it's off the side of a ridge. Here's more of an extreme example of a draw, a steep one that comes down through. As you can see, the top of the topography, the lines are further apart, meaning that it's less steep where you get to the bottom where the lines are closer together. This is another area, I've been talking about the bucks running, over the side of the hills along these areas, and draws are another great example of that, especially when they get steeper down towards the bottom. They're going to be kind of running up towards that upper third of the hill for the most part. Mm-hmm. On the map here, you can see where the topographical lines are steeper on the upper side, and then they're steeper on the lower side. And you have a section here in the center that the lines are spread apart a little bit more. What you can expect is a little bit of a bench. And so those are areas I'm also going to check out. If I'm finding, a point that has bedding on it, I'm finding a good ridge line, some saddles, some travel corridors. The next thing I'm looking for are these benches that can be off the side of the mountain, be able to check those out. A lot of times you'll find the rubs there, you'll find scrapes that are running those side hills. The last one that I want to talk about as far as a terrain feature is a creek bottom. And there's a couple different types of creek bottoms. You have the major ones, the bigger rivers that are flowing through it, but those aren't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the smaller feeder streams. Some can be as small as 4 to 6 foot wide. Some of them can be 10 to 20 foot wide. With the creek bottoms, it's the hardest part about creek bottoms. I love hunting them, and I've had a lot of success with hunting creek bottoms, but it all depends on the terrain around it. In the example that I have in the map here, this would not be a great example of hunting a creek bottom. Reason being is the terrain is really steep coming down to it and would cause swirling winds. It'd be really difficult to hunt. Not saying that the deer aren't going to use it and cross through it like they would any other one, but it's pretty steep to run through there. With that being said, they can be great access for when you're going into a stand. You're going to go up on top of a ridge. You want to start from the bottom essentially in the mornings with the downward thermals coming down off the hill. Use those creek bottoms, sneak up through, and then cut up the draw that you're trying to get up to be able to be stealthy and kind of slip in there in the mornings while the deer are feeding. So in addition to terrain features, you can identify vegetation features on the map. And so I'm going to go in here and show you a bunch of the different vegetation features I'm looking for and how to identify them using Onyx. One of the first things I want to talk about is surrounding conifer thickets. So I'm talking hemlock trees, pine trees, spruce trees, anything of that nature. And why I'm talking about those type of trees, conifer trees, is one, especially in like the late season and everything, they provide great bedding for thermal cover. They're cutting the winds down. They can be identified on the aerial map by a bluish, greenish tint, a darker tint. These are one of the tougher things to be able to identify on a map, but they are possible. So if we're looking at a map here. You can tell on the top we have some different, you can see different vegetation features and stuff, but as you dive down in here, these areas here that are just slightly darker in color, I would imagine that that's going to be a bunch of conifer trees, most likely hemlocks. Since deer and bucks generally love to run edges of any sort, this is just another barrier or another feature that's breaking up the timber. I remember getting that sinking feeling in my stomach when I'd walk into my hunting area and realize that there was trees marked and there's a skidder in there. They're starting to cut down and log an area. And what I ended up realizing is that can actually be a benefit to you. Is it going to change things? Yes, it 100% is. But these logging cuts, especially the fresh ones, can provide great food sources from the tops when they cut them down. And as those timber cuts get older, they just get better at providing bedding cover, more additional food sources. And the reason for that, so when you look at an old growth forest or a forest that has a lot of big trees, you notice underneath it, there's not much other species of plants and trees that are growing. The vegetation cover underneath is pretty bare and open. And although that looks nice and pretty, that's not as healthy as an area that has a lot of those big trees cut down, allowing the new growth to sprout, get sunlight, and grow up. And that's where it creates a bunch of food sources for deer and other animals as well. So here's a good way of showing here. You can see the differences in the vegetation that you can tell are these clear cuts or timber cuts. By using the timber cuts feature, you're able to see logging operations from the last 5 years, and that really helps for trying to find those good cuts in that 3 to 8 year old range that I'm really focusing on, just because of all the food and the bedding cover available. And by being able to turn this on and seeing all of these logging cuts, and let's look at one for example. You can see here, this one shows logging cut 2017. You can see all of the boundary around it, how big that cut is. If you click on it, it'll say when it was cut in 2017, the type of cut it was. For example, this one was a shelter wood removal cut, so they left some trees there, and it was managed by one of the specific ranger districts in this 37-acre timber cut. That is so important to be able to check that out. So for example, with me, I'm looking at this cut. It's 2017, so we're about 3 years old that this cut is. It's at a very good age where the blackberry briars and some of that new growth is starting to come up, creating very good feed for the deer. Hunting in the middle of one of these cuts really isn't beneficial, and a couple reasons for that. One, it doesn't really create as many funnels, but also the undergrowth isn't tall enough yet that the deer don't feel secure of walking through those in the middle of the day. And if you do find a tree you're able to climb in that they left up, you're probably going to stick out like a sore thumb. So sticking to the edges can be very helpful when it comes to hunting these areas. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what I consider the 3 categories or age groups of timber cuts. I'm going to look at the food sources that are within them, the bedding cover, as well as how I would set up and hunt these areas. The first one I want to talk about is the cuts in the 0 to 3-year-old age group. So these are the new cuts from the time that they hit the ground through a few years and beginning to regenerate. The cuts in the 0 to 3-year-old age group are probably the worst for bedding out of all the timber cuts, but still be used for bedding. The newer cuts have treetops that provide great places to bed because they'll have the brush up against their back with being able to see what's out in front of them. And even though that these cuts are generally open, they will bed in some of those areas. How I would hunt these newer clear cuts would be that I would understand the knowledge of the food sources and the bedding available and put that together as a plan of attack. As I said, these are probably the most productive on colder days. So when it comes to like a later season rifle hunt or late season archery, these areas have my attention a lot more than they do earlier in the season. If you find a fresh logging operation right around when there's a cold spell hitting, one thing that I've done in the past is actually even talk to the loggers, see what they're seeing for deer sign. But as soon as those tops come down are the best time to catch them feeding on them rather than historical tops that have been laying there for a while. All different years of timber cuts provide food sources for the deer, but specifically when you're looking at the timber cuts that are in the 0 to 3-year-old range, the deer are focusing on a lot of the tops that they cut down and left, so the loggers didn't take some of the tops of the trees, and also some of the grasses that you can see behind me that are coming up. The deer are feeding through those, specifically focusing on these areas in the winter months, cold weather. They seem to migrate to these areas to feed. The next category of clear cut or timber cut I want to go into are the ones that are in that 3 to 8-year-old range. And these, as the logging cuts begin to age, briars, dewberry, blackberry bushes, they're all starting to grow thick in these areas. The deer love to browse on these while adding some cover to an open landscapes. Now it's becoming a better bedding area as well. But the skid trails that are going through these cuts are beginning to grow up with these luscious grasses that provide grazing and easy walking paths for the deer to be able to navigate through the thickness, the growth around them. So you're starting to not only create more food and bedding, but you're also creating natural funnels within them because the deer aren't wanting to walk through the thickest parts if they don't have to. So right here on the edge, we're on the edge of this clear cut, this 8-year-old clear cut, and we have trails that are running down both sides coming up. There's a trail that runs into the cut here. We got one that crosses here, and it's a really good travel area for this deer coming out of the corner, and in my mind would be a great place to set up. So this tree behind me, we're probably about 15 yards off of the main trail and 25 yards from another one that comes out of the cut with the crossings here. With that westerly wind coming out and a buck scent checking the does, you want to be just off of that wind. So the wind is in their favor, but you're just off to the side and able to capitalize. So the reason why I picked this tree behind me, it's kind of a double tree. It almost kind of grows together. And I would take my saddle set up on the back side of the tree with this secondary tree kind of blocking my weak side shot. So that's a shot that I'm not real comfortable with anyways. So that'll keep me concealed from any bucks that become cruising down this edge. But also allow me to be able to slip around the side of the tree, keep the tree in between me and the deer, and be able to execute the shot. I believe that the bedding in these areas are some of the best bedding that you're going to find out of any of the cuts. And the reason for that is it gets so thick, they're getting the new growth trees that are coming up in bushes, which provide most of the food that they want in one location. Plus, they can bed all throughout it that can be tough to pinpoint. Generally on the edge of the thick areas is where you're going to find most of the bedding. They might be tucked back into it a little bit, but they always want some sort of an open area in front of them to be able to visualize and see any predators coming. The last section are the older cuts that I consider 8 or 10 years old or older. And As the logging cuts get this age, mushrooms start to grow on the old stumps and logs, providing a new food source for the deer. Although it's not as prevalent, you can still find briar, dewberry, and some blackberry bushes throughout these older cuts. The trees are growing taller and thicker in diameter, which can start to drown out some of the undergrowth cover as you start to get to those ages, but it'll still be used in bedding. In this case, I definitely tend to find the deer more on the outskirts than you do on the internal of these cuts. When logging cuts get over 8 years old, they tend to still hold a lot of bedding, even though it kind of drowns out the undergrowth underneath it. There's not as much browse for food as there is in the ones in that 3 to 8 year old range. But the deer still love to bed, especially on the outskirts of them. Does will be bedded, just inside the cut, similar to the previous age of the timber cuts. But in addition to that, they're using those grassy logging roads to travel in between, rubbing and scraping along the ways. The problem with trying to hunt on the interior of these cuts is that you can't find a tree that's usually good enough to be able to get into. It's usually thick with those trees in the 6 to 10 inch in diameter, sometimes even smaller yet. You can get in those especially like with a saddle, you can get in those trees, but it's extremely difficult to be able to do so. So in my opinion, it is still best to hunt the outskirts, hunt the edges, hunt those defined edges. So you have the thick, clear cut that's behind me, and in front of me, in this situation we're in now, we have a newer cut where they select cut the area, took out all the underbrush, and just have some big timber trees. That creates a hard edge. That can be the same if you had a big oak ridge or something else where you're just breaking up that thick cover with more of the open timber. Those deer will run the edges. The same holds true as it was with the younger age clear cuts. Those bucks are going to travel that edge downwind side to be able to scent check for does in that cut. And when you have a situation like the one we have here where you have a newer cut right on the edge of it, it's bedding and feed right next to each other. It's a no-brainer to set up right on the edge of this cut. Lastly, a hunting style that's rarely used but can be extremely effective is still hunting. So still hunting is something I would use usually in the November time frame during the rut when calling can be effective, because when you're sneaking through these cuts as quiet as you possibly can, as slow as you possibly can, you're sneaking through, and then all of a sudden you want to get aggressive. What you're trying to do in this type of hunting style is get a buck up out of his bed to come in and want to fight you, essentially. So I'll use some aggressive grunts, snap sticks when I'm close to areas where I think that bucks could be bedded or I've found them in the past. You need to have an arrow nocked, be ready to shoot, because it can happen in a split second where a buck's right on top of you. Hunting the big woods is different in many ways than hunting farm country. Generally, the farm country deer grow bigger, and because they have more food sources, more nutritious food sources, sometimes less pressure. There's a lot of variables that come into that. But I've found that areas in the big woods that have a lot of timber cuts, a lot of variety of that food, tend to grow bigger bodied deer, and in turn bigger antlered deer, because they have such a nutritional value. Areas with big old growth forests throughout seem like they're better with their big acorn crops and things along those lines, but they're not a year-round food source, where logging cuts are providing food no matter what time of the year it is. They're finding a variety of food within these cuts. When hunting timber cuts, or really most places in the big woods, one of the things I focus on is running trail cameras on scrapes, because that's their way of communication. The bucks are using it, rubbing their preorbital gland and their forehead glands all up on the branches and being able to leave scent across. And how you tell the difference kind of between a community scrape versus, just a regular scrape that a buck makes based on its testosterone at the time is you'll find it seems to be usually a bigger area. Sometimes you'll have a bigger licking branch that's broke off. In my opinion, that comes from some bigger deer, especially if they're higher up, because of their body. They can kind of stand up and get at that a little bit easier. So I'll run cameras on these scrapes,
And for most of the year, actually, they'll work these licking branches. But the most effective time to run cameras on these scrapes is anywhere from the middle of October through the end of November. And the way I'm hunting these scrapes is I'm usually always having one in the area. I might not be necessarily set up right on top of it, but usually along the travel path. So that's all going to dictate on if there's a better crossing, more trails down a little bit, I might set up on that. Or depending on the wind direction, I might set up downwind a little bit of the scrape in case the bucks are going to move about 30 yards down and scent check it. It's all situational and it's difficult to figure out, but you can bet anywhere from the middle of October to the end of November, which is for a lot of us, it's archery season, is I'm going to have a scrape within the immediate area of where I'm hunting.
Next time you see a skidder or a logging truck going into your area, you should be excited rather than disappointed because there are many years of good hunting to come.
That video, that was awesome. I'm sure that everybody that tuned in really enjoyed it. I know that, I certainly did. I'm sure everybody was able to learn something, probably more than one thing. I know I definitely did. So before we get into any of the questions, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, make sure to submit them through Crowdcast now so we can get to them. We have a little bit of time, so we have time to take questions. Like I said, we're shooting for trying to wrap up around 9 o'clock or so. If for some reason you end up thinking of a question later on, we'll have an opportunity for you to be able to get those questions submitted to us afterwards as well. So with that being said, we're going to get into the first question here, Bo. So the first question comes from Seth. Seth asks, I feel like whitetail hunters take scent control much more into consideration than hunters out west that hunt elk, for example. Do you feel this way? I guess my point is I've had deer close and downwind of me, but I feel like my scent control has helped with that. And I always hear Western hunters talk about getting winded. Just curious on your thoughts on scent control in general.
Yeah, so I mean, I do pay attention to scent control, and I wash all my clothes and scent-free stuff and kind of go through the whole mixture there. But to be honest, I don't follow any super hard and fast scent control practices. I'm relying on playing the wind for the most part, which can be difficult in the mountains, as I kind of described in the video. But I mean, I don't, I guess a lot of, guys that hunt farm country and stuff like that wear rubber boots. I don't. I wear leather boots, which can be, a little bit worse for scent control, but I really don't pay attention to it a whole lot, to be honest. And I haven't noticed that being a huge impact on me specifically.
All right. Next question comes from Robin. Robin asks, how do you hunt heavy mountain laurel areas?
So heavy mountain laurel areas, those can be awesome areas for hiding big bucks and traveling through them. It's really difficult to hunt in the middle of the mountain laurel because of how thick it is, as anybody that's been around it can understand. But hunting just on the edge of it is, as I talked about, even with clear cuts and stuff like that, I'm the same way with mountain laurel. Or if you can find, say there's a giant patch of it and you can find a spot that has a few openings within it, they still feel like they have that security cover around them, but at the same time, you still have opportunities to be able to shoot in that thick stuff. Hunting mountain laurel in that thick type of country doesn't really allow you to see many deer, but I think your quality of deer increases when you're hunting in those type of areas. But essentially, I'm looking for scrapes on either the edge or on an interior opening of that mountain laurel.
All right, perfect. Next question comes from Brent. Brent asks, do you change areas as the rut fires up, or do you stick to the same areas?
I definitely change a decent amount when the rut comes in. I'm focusing. I guess there's a couple different stages. The pre-rut and then into the rut are a little bit different for me. So pre-rut, I'm focusing almost 100% on hunting scrapes. And as the early season goes on, I'm actually closer to more, bedding type areas, closer to some thicker cover. And then as it gets into the pre-rut, I'm focusing on those scrapes that are, within 300-400 yards of bedding. Sometimes that can be, in creek bottoms, depending on what the terrain looks like. Sometimes that might be up on, the side of a ridge on a bench, something like that. But I'm mostly focusing on scrapes at that time. And then as you get into the rut, I'm focusing on more of those travel corridors. As you hear with any, rut type tips, between doe bedding areas. But with those bedding just about anywhere in the mountains, it's a little bit more difficult to figure that out. But as you go and say you're bumping deer scouting or doing stuff like that, kind of putting that in your head and focusing on those travel areas. So things like that might be on one side of the ridge of a saddle, or at the very top of a draw as that comes up. That's a great area I like to focus in on. And then also I'm a big fan of creek bottoms. So, and what I'll do with creek bottoms is find a place that it funnels them down. So as you have a bunch of different valleys that are running down into that creek bottom, you'll have bucks coming off the top of the ridges, heading into another spot. So if you have some crossings, maybe a beaver pond or something there that helps funnel that movement to that one location, it's a game of patience during the rut. But if you sit there for 3 or 4 days, you should have a pretty good opportunity at something. And with creek bottoms, focusing on those thermals that are pulling down the stream or the creek for a while, that really can play to your benefit.
All right. Next question comes from Brent. Brent asks, I hunt an area with a few 15-plus-year-old cuts that have been fenced in. The fences just came down this past summer. Any advice on how to hunt it this November and December?
So in my experience with areas like that, is those fenced-in cuts are extremely thick once they pull down the fences because the deer haven't been able to browse on them. So they're killer for a food source and then also bedding areas. But it's really tough to hunt those interiors of them unless you can find like a logging trail or something that goes in them. But most of the time I'm hunting on the downwind side of those cuts where it say meets mature timber or meets a draw or some sort of terrain feature. And I'm hunting just on the edge to a point where I can shoot into the cut a little bit if possible, or right on the edge. 'Cause sometimes it seems like the mature bucks don't like to come completely out into the open. They like to stay in that cover a little bit. But, with the briar bushes and all that stuff that's starting to grow up, you can really use that to your advantage. But hunting right on the exterior of that is big because those does are going to love to bed in there. They can stand up and feed all day. That can be really good. I hunted actually a decent amount of those type of cuts last year.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Next question comes from Ethan. Bo, if you bump a deer on the edge of bedding cover, leaving your stand in the evening, would you hunt from that same tree again within the week, or would you shift your location?
I'd still hunt there again. I wouldn't really, I guess it depends on the time of year too, but I wouldn't worry about it that much. If you're bumping, deer every single time you're leaving, you might want to try to find a different area. But if you bump something once, especially, so if I'm leaving a stand in the evening, normally, when I'm climbing down and leaving, it's about dark, and right around that dark time frame, it seems like they don't spook as bad either as if you were to bump them in the day. And just in my experience, I wouldn't worry about it. I'd still go in there the next morning, especially if it's, depending on the time of year, if it's the rut or pre-rut, they're not going to be too worked up over it.
Okay, next question comes from George. We will be hunting antlerless in a couple of weeks during muzzleloader season up in the Kahana Wild area. Can you give any examples about whether your advice is different for that hunt compared to bucks during the rut or regular rifle season?
I should say there wouldn't be a whole lot of difference of the way you're hunting bucks, because essentially bucks during the rut, because essentially you're hunting bucks where the does are going to be or similar type things. But just to give, with that muzzleloader season coming in before the rut in Pennsylvania, one thing to note is, especially in mountain type areas like the area he's talking about going to, the does a lot of times are traveling up and down the mountain rather than side to side. So that's why during a rut, a lot of the bucks are traveling around the ridges trying to cross those doe trails that come up. You know, say the primary food source is above them and the does are bedded a little bit below. They're going up and down, or say that there's a good black cherry crop down in the bottom and they're coming down. So they're going to be doing more up and down movements than lateral. And again, this is a rule of thumb. It's definitely not a, tried and true, this is going to happen every time. But I think some of the same tactics can work, well. And even with scrapes, I mean, does are working scrapes just as much as bucks are. They're not pawing up the ground, but they're coming through and touching the licking branch up and doing that. So I think some of the similar tactics of focusing on really vegetation edges and using the different terrain features can be really beneficial.
Awesome. All right. Looks like we do not have any more questions. So everyone that's tuning in, I will give, oh, there's one. Sorry, I missed one. I got bumped to the top. Lyle asks, in big woods or mountain settings with lower deer densities, how long are you willing to give a location before moving on?
I'd say 3 to 4 days. It depends. And again, this is all dependent on, if the sign is there and, and it's a low deer density area, I'd give it 3 days at least to kind of be able to figure that out. If you get like a crazy hunch that's not right, kind of trust your gut. But at the same time, if you're confident in your area, in which you have to be to go into it, then I usually typically give areas about 3 days before I move on. And I've done the complete opposite, where I've moved almost every day, and I tend to not have as much success as if I'm patient in those low deer density areas. Again, they're not going to travel the same trails every day. There's no good patterning involved when it comes to these type of deer. So, especially when you're hunting like thicker areas, you might be on one trail and that deer could be, there could be a bunch of deer walking within 60 yards of you, and you may never see them or hear them. So it is a game of patience. So I'd definitely give it some time.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. Looks like as of now, we had 7 questions submitted. You've answered all 7. So I'll give anyone tuning in, I'll give everyone a minute here to submit any final questions that you would have before we wrap up for the evening. So we'll kind of give that a minute here. In the meantime, I am going to announce, we had the winner, right? So we talked about in the beginning that we were going to do the Filson. We were going to do the door prize, right? They were going to do the large draw duffel bag as well as the wool hat. We mentioned anyone that registered, we were going to raffle that off at the end of tonight's event. So the winner for that drawing was Brian Jordan. So Brian, if you are tuning in right now, we will get in touch with you within the next couple of days to kind of discuss, go from here as far as getting that stuff to you. If you are not watching right now, we'll catch up later on anyway. So that was our winner. And then while we wait for, see if you have any questions. No other questions now. So that covers my portion. Bo also has another surprise giveaway that he is going to take over and announce for us.
Yeah, so I have a couple things to say here. If anyone has any questions, or say you're watching this video late or something you think of is, you want to bring up, feel free to shoot me an email. You can get my email by just either sending it to Bo, which is BEAU @eastmeetswesthunt.com, or head over to my website, eastmeetswesthunt.com, and fill out the little pop-up form that comes up to subscribe to the newsletter, and you can contact me that way as well. And send me those questions, because I will be doing on my podcast, the East Meets West Hunt podcast. I'm doing a couple Q&A mountain, big woods, buck type related podcasts coming up here. So send over those questions. And if you do, and even if you don't have a question, you want to go over to the website and sign up for the mailing list, I'm going to choose 3 of you to send OnX Elite memberships. So each of them are $99 values for a 1-year membership to all the states, everything that I covered in this. So I'll give away some OnX memberships. So I'll be doing that. What's today here? Wednesday. So I'd say by Friday, I'm going to give away those 3 memberships. So definitely go over. Like I said, if you have questions, shoot me them there. And if not, and you just want to sign up for the mailing list, I'll put you in the entry as well for the 3 OnX memberships. So
Awesome.
Yeah, that I appreciate everyone tuning in here. This was great, and I hope if any more questions come in, I'd love to be able to answer them.
Absolutely, Bo. You did a great job. Thank you for putting that together for us. I think we all appreciated it very much. Make sure to check out his content. He knows what he's talking about, as you saw from watching his presentation tonight. Puts out some cool stuff, both in Pennsylvania and out west as well. So lots of different demographics. Looks like we actually got another question that came in. Bo, are you good on time to answer a couple more questions before we wrap up?
Definitely.
Perfect. So everyone knows we have till 9 o'clock, I would say. So if you have a question you just thought about, feel free to submit it. We'll get into the next couple questions here. So let's go with, okay. Next question, Bo, comes from Ryan. Ryan asks, e-scouting included, what would your direction/guidance be for an out-of-towner, say hunting for 4 days?
So I guess it's kind of a general question. It's hard to really dive into that. But the one thing I would say is, if you're going into an area, is trying to identify areas that have the most variety in vegetation features, and also with terrain features that combine with those. So as you're looking at, say, a big area you're planning on going, say you have a specific state forest or game land or something, looking for those areas that have a variety, that have the clear cuts, that have hemlock thickets, that have big timber, maybe have some terrain, so some side hills, things like that. Looking for those areas is probably going to hold the most deer, because you got cover, 2, you're going to have feed and some of those clear cuts, and say maybe some mass crops and the big timber. Going there, and the biggest thing, so once you identify those areas, don't just run in and set up a stand or whatever you're going to do right there. Spend some time scouting. If you only had 4 days to hunt, spend a whole day scouting until you find that hot sign to be able to hunt. With a short hunt like that, you need to be able to be hunting the hot sign, especially when you're not familiar with the area. So my advice would be is to identify some of those key features there, go and get boots on the ground and see it for yourself, and hunt the sign, and not otherwise you're never wasting your time, but you might be kind of wasting your time with the trip there. So spend time more scouting and then hunt from there.
Perfect. I'm going to actually leapfrog. We have 2 questions left right now. I'm going to leapfrog one to get to the last one, because it relates pretty closely to what you were just discussing, Bo. So Steve was asking, if you weren't able to scout over the summer, what are some tips for scouting during the season?
Yeah, that's all 100% hot sign. I mean, looking at the maps ahead of time really helps you out with kind of looking at areas. And I guess one thing I would say to everyone, I talk about going in far to find stuff, stay away from people, but there's also some value in finding those overlooked spots. So say spots along a dirt road that don't necessarily have pull-offs or anything there that you might be able to key in on. There's a lot of different things there, but the biggest thing is getting boots on the ground and finding the hot sign of what's going on right now. And in the big woods, you're not finding, you don't have these, big primary food sources. You don't have bean fields, corn fields, stuff like that. So you need to find what they're feeding on right now. And by walking around and again, just putting boots on the ground, I wouldn't worry as much about spooking deer at that point, because if you don't find them, then there's no point in it, and you're out of the game before you even got in it. So finding where they're digging, you can kind of see where they're milling around, and the ferns and stuff are matted down. Those are type areas you're looking for and trying to figure out what they're feeding on. And then also, depending on the time of year, looking at I'm hunting scrapes almost year round, as far as having one in the area, looking for scrapes. Rubs can tell you a little bit. I don't focus much on rubs, but really just trying to figure out what the deer are doing right now. It would be my biggest, I guess, advice for that. I'll most likely be hunting some areas this year. If I get lucky enough and fill my Pennsylvania tag early, I'm planning on either hunting Ohio, New York, and places I've never stepped foot on in my life. And that's the way I'm going to go into it.
All right. Looks like our last question at this point is from Ethan. Ethan asks, do you set up any stands and leave them, or do you always run a mobile setup?
That goes. So as of right now, this year I don't have any that are preset stands, but I have done that in the past, and it can be really beneficial. For me, it was just kind of a time thing with Pennsylvania having to have your stands. You have to put them up only 2 weeks before the season and have them down. It was just tough for me to really know exactly where I'm going to be to get those stands in there. But for the most part, I'm hunting mobile with those spots. But what I'll do, if I'm planning on hunting the same spot multiple days in a row, I'll leave my stuff in the tree overnight and then, come back to that same spot. But for the most part, I've been hunting mobile. But I do see a lot of benefit if you do have the time to hang those preset locations as well. So that's kind of what I do.
Perfect. Looks like I don't think we have any more questions at the moment. I'll just take one last scroll through here and make sure we didn't miss any. All right, looks like that is all the questions that we had tonight. So unless any other questions come in here in the next few seconds or so, we will probably wrap up for the evening. So Bo, thank you again for taking the time to put the presentation together and for answering questions. Thank you for everybody that tuned in. These are some really good questions. I think, it seems like people are paying attention and, really kind of thinking about the content that was presented. So that's awesome. I'm glad to see this engagement. Obviously we're all trying to navigate different times in 2020 here, but having these kinds of events where we can all come together and talk about something we all love to do is really important, I think. Again, for anyone tuning in still, BHA and Filson have some of the collaboration gear out right now. It's some cool stuff. Like I said in the beginning, if you weren't tuned in yet, I actually have one of the hats here. They're pretty cool. And then I have one of the kind of beanie hats as well. So I appreciate everybody giving me the attention as well as your moderator and host. Bo, any last thoughts?
I just say, the questions everyone asked were very, very good, and appreciate those. I love getting to talk about those things. It seems like at asking the right questions with it, and as we're coming into, deer season's already kicked off, but as we're kind of getting into the brunt of it, good luck to everyone, and always feel free to shoot me a message, whether it's on Instagram or my email or anything. I'd love to be able to help out with the best of my ability. Again, this is, just my opinions from, there's, a million ways to skin a cat, but I appreciate everyone tuning in here, and good luck to everyone this season. I'm pumped, and also, thank you for being a great moderator here. I really appreciate it.
Happy to help. Got to talk about hunting, right? That's something happy to talk about. So
yep, I agree. I'm all about it.
I echo the same sentiments. Great luck to everybody that's going to be out this year. I'm going to throw it out there too before we wrap up here. Just be safe. If you're going to be a tree stand, my personal recommendation would be to use some kind of harness or something. I already saw an article the other day about someone that fell off a tree stand. So just be careful, be safe, enjoy it. We're fortunate to be able to have these opportunities to go out, whether it's on public land or private. And I wish everybody the best of luck this season. Thanks for tuning in.